Dad was drunk again. Rain swept over my windshield like waves over a beach as I drove him home from yet another bar where he'd made a fool of himself. He wasn't the drunken brawler type, no. He was a crier. He'd sit at the bar with his head on the table and just start sobbing, wailing, bringing down the whole mood of the place. Even now, he shifted between crying and sniffling while staring out the passenger window, and half-conscious states where he couldn't muster the mental coherence to even register such complex emotions. At one point, he even leaned over the center console and tried to hug me, almost making me jerk the steering wheel. "Dad, no. Christ, I'm trying to drive. Here," I snapped at him. "Keep on your half of the car or I'm pulling over." Like a loyal dog, he recognized the tone of my words even if not their meaning, and shrunk back sheepishly. Since I was in elementary school, people told me I was remarkably mature for my age. But you kind of have to be when you're forced to act like the parent of the family. The road traveled parallel to our sole local river, the one the school kids all called the Devil's Gutter. It snaked in and out of sight behind the tree line, as if it liked to taunt every driver that passed. The damn thing was evil, I knew, but I couldn't help but feel a certain nostalgic fondness for it. It was the only thing offering any sense of danger and mystique to what would have otherwise been the least interesting small town in the country. From a glance, it seemed mild, shallow, and narrow enough to make it across with a leap. There was no way of telling that it was actually hundreds of feet deep, that the undercurrent was stronger than an Olympic swimmer could withstand, that the banks were undercut and impossible to climb back up once you were in, that the carbonated water had intricately carved networks of hundreds of channels and caves deep into the limestone. Misjudge your leap, and you'd be seized by the undercurrent, dashed against the rocks, plunged deep into some dark cave within which your body would be preserved forever, pinned to a wall or ceiling of stone like some macabre decoration. The gutter features in our every folktale and ghost story. When I was a kid, we liked to tell the tale of O.L. Bart O'Neill, a 19th century prospector whose cat was apparently very popular with the neighborhood toms. Every time she'd get knocked up, it was said, he'd gather up the kittens into a burlap sack and toss them all into the Devil's Gutter. At least, and this was when whoever was telling the story would lower their voice to a whisper until they found his body in his bed, shredded by hundreds of small claws. His eyes had been clawed out, his fingers bitten off like carrots, his ribcage torn open. And within his chest, the police found dozens of tiny poops. That's right. According to legend, the spectral kittens had used his chest cavity as a litter box. That was all made up, of course. The crude invention of imaginative schoolboys. But I have looked through old newspapers and found that someone named Bart O'Neill really did disappear from town a long while ago. No gory details, just up and vanished. The only oddity I noticed was that, when his cat was found still locked up in a cage in his shed a week after his disappearance, it was well fed, as if somebody had been sneaking in and caring for it. See, this is why I hate taking this road. With every glimpse of that river, my mind always wanders. Back to old memories, terrible memories, ones that would have been better left forgotten. It ignites a fire in me, a sort of morbid curiosity I've come to dread. But then Dad broke my line of thought with a long, obnoxiously loud groan. And then I was thinking of the first time I had him in my passenger seat, while I was some anxiety-ridden kid, no older than 15, didn't even have my driver's license yet, my hands shaking late that New Year's night as I struggled to dodge all the other drunk morons swerving all over the road. New Year's was always the worst night for him. This would have been our anniversary, he was groaning. It would have been our 15th. I got over what happened to Mom over a decade ago. Why couldn't he? We aren't the only people who experienced loss, anyway. When I was growing up, the whole town mourned the death of Annabelle, captain of our high school cheerleading squad. She had tried to jump the gutter, and even cleared it, but there'd just been rain, and the muddy opposite bank gave way beneath her feet, and she went right in. Crazy thing was, 15 minutes later, they got a ping from some SOS beacon her mother had made her wear. They took this as proof she'd made it out alive but injured, and triggered a frantic search of the surrounding area, with no luck. There were rumors, however improbable, that she'd found her way into an air pocket somewhere in that limestone cave system, just close enough to the surface that just one of her desperate calls for help managed to make it through. Sometimes I picture her down there, in a kind of darkness I cannot fathom, struggling to keep her head above the water. I wonder if she knew that surrounding her, somewhere in the dark, were the corpses of those who had been pulled into those caves before her. I picture a gaunt, bleached hand brushing her ankle as those currents carry one by. I imagine her crowded on all sides by the gaunt, empty eyes of the people who'd found their way into that air pocket before her, and never found their way out. Maybe it was for the best that she would have been in complete darkness. There my mind went, again. I'd gotten another glimpse of the river, and couldn't help but imagine Anna down there, as if her eyes were looking up at me from beneath those blackened waters. I tried to turn up the radio, to take my mind off it and to drown out Dad's moaning and sobbing. But he grunted as if the very sound offended him, and drunkenly pawed at the dashboard until he turned it back off. I already knew what he'll say tomorrow. "I've let you down," he'd say, head down like a dog caught peeing on the carpet. "I've never been the father I should have been. And it'll all be very genuine, and very sincere, and very, very temporary. I've even helped pay for his rehab, once. He'd been found choked half to death on his own vomit. This is a wake-up call," he'd said. "I'm finally ready to be the dad you've always needed me to be." A few grand seemed like a small price to pay to have my dad back. And indeed, for a few months of sobriety, he was the best dad on earth, the best I ever could have asked for. And then came New Year's again, and it was suddenly like none of it ever happened. My eyes glimpsed a cross set up along the gutter, a bouquet left at its base. I knew exactly who it was for. When I was in 4th grade, Bethany, a little girl who went to the same school as me, was swallowed up by the gutter. Her father was the only one who witnessed the accident, and there'd been some suspicious circumstances, I don't really remember, something about marital issues, custody, that sort of thing. Point was, everybody suspected him. But what proof did we have? The gutter never parts with its secrets. 3 years or so later, her dad just up and vanished, too. Nobody thought much of it, at first. Everyone assumed he got tired of the side eyes and just skipped town. But then, months after everyone had forgotten the whole business, someone started sending around a voicemail he'd apparently sent out at 3 in the morning, the night he disappeared. It had apparently been sent to some random coworker from his contacts list. An accident, clearly. The first minute or two just consisted of the sort of rustling you'd expect from a pocket dial, so they hadn't thought much of it. It hadn't been until their curiosity drove them to investigate deeper that they realized they could hear the dad's heavy, belabored breathing, and the sounds of twigs and leaves crackling beneath his feet, as if he were wandering through the middle of the woods. Moreover, off in the distance, they could hear another voice. The faint voice of a little girl, bubbly and giggling, like they were playing a game. "Daddy?" The voice kept crying out into the night. "Daddy, where are you?" They noticed, too, that you couldn't hear any crickets or birds or anything else you'd expect out in the forest at night. Everything was dead silent, like all the creatures of the woods sensed the presence of a predator. The dad's breathing grew heavier and more panicked whenever the voice grew louder, nearer, but it remained stifled, as if he was desperately trying to keep quiet, remain unnoticed. Eventually, she was so close that you could hear her little footsteps in the leaves, and the dad didn't even dare to breathe. And then, the sound of branches being parted, the father's gasp, and that little voice laughing and declaring in a sing-song tone, "Daddy, I found you." And at that exact moment, the voicemail reached its time limit. The cop's official line was that it was a fake, just some audio doctored up by bored teenagers to feed into the sensationalized mythology of the Devil's Gutter. But Bethany's remaining relatives swore up and down that they recognized that giggly little voice, that it was unmistakable. Lost in thought, I blinked, and somehow, in that instant, a woman appeared in the middle of the road. I can't remember the next few seconds. It was as if I'd time traveled. One moment, I was driving along, and the next I was stuck in a muddy ditch on the roadside, the hood just inches away from an oak tree sturdy enough to have bisected my car. And Dad was screaming like a madman, incoherently at first, but then congealing into a name. Jessica. He was screaming out for Mom, I realized. Jessica. And as he screamed, he threw open the passenger side door and tore off into the woods with a drunken stumble. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the woman was still standing there in the road, a vague silhouette barely illuminated by whatever moonlight broke through the storm. But when I looked back with my own eyes, she was gone. I cursed like a sailor as I took off into the storm, blindly in the direction I thought my dad had went. My heart was in my throat. We were so close to the gutter, in his state, he could so easily fall in, become just another name in its long list, another creepy story to tell on school playgrounds. But then it became clear I was in the same danger. The storm was picking up rapidly, sideways rain blasting my eyes, wind tugging at the trees by their roots. Yet somehow, stupidly, what terrified me most was the prospect that, while stumbling through those darkened woods, I might hear a little girl's voice off in the distance shouting, "Daddy." Suddenly, I froze in place. I realized I could hear the bubbling and crashing of the gutter's current, even over the storm. It must be so close. I tried to look for it, but the rain seared my eyes whenever I was not covering them with an arm. I was too terrified to take a step in any direction, but the storm took action for me, by sweeping away the mud beneath my feet. Anna's fate flashed in my mind. The muddy bank giving way. My death wasn't even going to be original. I thrashed and floundered, feeling the earth seem to envelop me from below like a massive creature pulling me into its gullet. Through sheer luck, my random grabs caught purchase. A thick, sturdy tree root was all that saved me from the waters below, and I clung to it with every scrap of strength I had, even as the rain left it soaked and slippery. I managed to hold on for a while, with no way back up but unwilling to let go of my only lifeline. And then, I felt a cold hand wrap around my ankle. My body tensed with such horror that I lost my grip in an instant, and those cruel waters had me. They seemed to toy with me for a while, spinning me about under the surface as I curled up into the fetal position. The shock of the frigid cold caused me to suck down a breath instinctively, filling my lungs with water. As I scratched at my chest, my eyes opened for just a split second. On either side of me were those thick, limestone walls, pockmarked with the black abysses that were caves. And that limestone led down below, far below, disappearing into that infinite, inky blackness beneath me. The experts' guesses must have been wrong. The gutter couldn't just be a few hundred feet deep, it had to be a mile, at the very least. Just looking down into that darkness, I felt the same sense of vertigo as I'd felt looking down from the roof of the Empire State Building. That, and an overwhelming sense of things looking up at me, staring back. It reminded me of joining the theater group as a kid, standing on a stage for the first time and realizing that there were over 100 pairs of eyes on me, watching me, expecting a performance. Except this time, I knew they were here to watch me die. Watch me become one of them. Sink down, far below the surface, and join them in all that darkness. Never to see sunlight again, except vaguely through the surface of the water, miles above my new home. But even that didn't terrify me quite as much as the prospect of landing in one of those caves. Even as the undercurrent bashed me savagely against rocks, and my lungs cried for air, my only focus was avoiding them. I swear I could see bloated arms and grasping hands, reaching out from the dark of each cave, grasping for me as I passed by. As if each occupant was lonely, desperate for a companion in their eternal resting places. Suddenly, the current bashed my head against a rock, and from then everything was abstract and fuzzy. I could only muster a single coherent thought. Please, not here, it went. Don't let me die here. Somehow I knew that if I died beneath these waters, my soul would never break the surface. As if to answer my prayer, a pair of arms settled around me. Not the cold, grasping claws reaching from the caves, but something warm and comfortable, embracing me, cradling me close in a way that told me everything would be okay. Again, the next few seconds were a blur. I have no explanation for how I ended up back on the shore, shivering from the freezing waters and hacking, retching, emptying the water from my lungs upon the mud. All I know is, when I looked up, a bolt of lightning briefly illuminated the stone memorial looming above me, upon which read, INSS. I know everything about the mythology of the Devil's Gutter, because I was part of it. My family is one of the ones the school kids whisper about, the ones they make up wild stories and creepy theories about. Terminal cancer, they'd say around campfires, that was so horribly painful that not even the morphine could do anything for her. She'd been a painter, you know, always drawing portraits of the gutter. She was the only person who thought it was beautiful, not evil. So the legend goes, she begged her husband, please, take me to the river. Let me become part of it. I don't want to hurt anymore. They say that they did it on their anniversary. New Year's Day. I heard a long, choking rasp. For a moment, I was almost relieved. I thought it was another of my father's drunken groans. Then I realized it was coming from the river itself. I turned, and beheld a dozen hands reaching out over the side of the banks, unnameable things pulling themselves up from the waters. I only caught vague glimpses of the crawling, groaning creatures, briefly illuminated by the lightning. Their skins were bleached white and transparent, looking like road maps made of veins and arteries stretched taut over gray muscles and jagged ribs and putrid organs. Many were missing legs, arms, even heads. Others were more ancient still, mummified strands of flesh seemingly loosely stitched to the crumbling remains of a skeletal structure. All seemed to be looking right at me, even though none of them had any eyes to speak of, only empty, black sockets. They were crawling forwards with horrid determination. Once the gutter had taken you into its waters, laid its claim to you, it never wanted to let you go. They were only coming to retrieve what they were owed. I tried to crawl away through the mud, but it felt like crawling in a bad dream. It felt like the very planet was turning sideways, gravity itself guiding me back towards the river. Then a figure burst through the woods, large and heavy-set. My father. He stumbled into the middle of the crowd of the dead, waving his arms, trying to seize their attention. Take me! Take me, not them! Take me! He was screaming like a man possessed, but they didn't seem to even notice him. They were dead set on me, blind to the rest of the world. Then he turned to the lake, and my eyes followed his gaze to the woman from the road. Now her silhouette was standing in the middle of the river, seeming to hover a few inches above the water, her dress billowing in the wind. Jessica! Take me! Tell them to take me! He let out a primal, raw scream, one that must have torn his throat to shreds. I don't want to hurt anymore. She calmly beckoned him with a finger, and in that moment, he knew what he had to do. He didn't even hesitate. He went sliding down the bank, and for a moment, he seemed to stand upon those bubbling, surging waters just like she did. His arms were stretched wide as he stumbled forward, as if ready to embrace her, and then I blinked, and they were gone. So too disappeared that legion of the dead. It seemed like they'd accepted the trade. One soul for another. The gutter always took its due. It would have been easy to tell everyone that my dad had just stumbled stupidly into the gutters during another of his drunken stupors. But I wanted people to remember his sacrifice. I weaved some tale of me falling in, and him jumping in after me and hoisting me out, even at the cost of his own life. It didn't make a lot of sense, I must admit, and some people even suspected me for a while. But eventually, everybody just accepted the idea of him being a hero in his last moments. Getting some redemption in the last. People like when stories get wrapped up in neat little bows. Sometimes I still dream about the two of them. Floating in the center of some underwater cave chamber, yet somehow illuminated by moonlight, and by the walls of the chamber all lined with glowing, pinprick white eyes, like stars in the sky. Dead but not dead, the currents still flowing about them, animating them like marionettes, spinning them around each other, my mother in my father's arms like a waltz, the way they were on their wedding day. Dancing, dancing, on and on forever, before their audience of the dead. My neighbor has been too friendly lately. I had been working late again, something I'd grown used to over the past few months. Chicago never truly sleeps, and it was common to see people still moving around the streets, even as the clock ticked past midnight. My apartment was just a few blocks away, and I'd made this walk home more times than I could count. The night was cool, the street lights buzzing softly overhead as I made my way down the familiar route. There wasn't much traffic, which was typical for this time of night. The occasional car would pass, and sometimes I could hear the distant hum of the L train. I checked my phone out of habit, scrolling through notifications without really paying attention to them. A message from a friend asking about plans for the weekend, a reminder about a bill due tomorrow. Just the usual. As I approached my building, I noticed Tom, my neighbor, outside by the garbage bins. He had a cigarette between his fingers, the glow lighting up his face briefly as he nodded in my direction. "Burning the midnight oil again?" he asked. "Yeah, work's been crazy lately," I replied, pausing for a moment before heading toward the door. "You?" "Couldn't sleep," he said, shrugging. "Figured I'd step out for a bit." I nodded, pushing the front door open. "See you around." "Take it easy," Tom replied before I disappeared inside. The elevator was sluggish as usual, and I found myself staring at the scratched-up panel of buttons. I lived on the 4th floor, and as the elevator crept upward, I glanced back at my phone. More notifications, more things to deal with tomorrow. When the elevator doors finally opened, I stepped into the quiet hallway. My apartment was at the far end, and I could see a faint light coming from under my door. I must have left the lamp on when I left earlier. Not unusual. I always forgot little things like that. But when I reached my door, something caught my attention. The door wasn't closed all the way. It was barely noticeable, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough to make me stop. I didn't remember leaving it like that. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, my hand hovering just above the knob. I reached for the door, but as I grasped the knob, I froze. The door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before leaving, as I always did. I stood there, staring at the knob, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I had been in such a hurry earlier that I forgot. But no, I distinctly remembered the click of the lock as I left. A knot tightened in my stomach as I pushed the door open. The apartment was quiet, everything seemingly in its place. The small lamp in the living room cast a soft glow, illuminating the familiar surroundings. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, twisting the lock back and forth as if to reassure myself that it was working properly. I walked into the living room, tossing my keys onto the counter, and that's when I saw it. Lying on the coffee table, where nothing had been earlier, was a photograph. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't remember leaving it there, and more importantly, I didn't own any printed photos. I stepped closer, my heart thudding in my chest. The photo was of me. Taken earlier today, on my walk from work. I recognized the street, the same one I had walked down just hours ago. My hand trembled as I picked it up, flipping it over to see if there was anything written on the back. There wasn't. Whoever took this photo had been watching me. They had followed me, and now they had been inside my apartment. I felt a rush of adrenaline, my mind racing with questions. How did they get in? Had I really left the door unlocked? I didn't think so. I quickly scanned the room again, looking for anything else that might have been moved, but everything seemed in place. I checked the windows, but they were locked too. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. I pulled it out, half expecting to see a message from the stalker, but it was just Tom, my neighbor. "Hey, you okay? You looked kind of off earlier," his message read. I stared at the screen, my thoughts too scattered to reply right away. Tom had been outside when I came home. Could he have noticed something? Should I tell him about the photo? I hesitated for a moment, staring at Tom's message. Should I tell him about the photo? Part of me wanted to confide in someone, but another part felt like I needed to keep it to myself, at least for now. I didn't know what I was dealing with, and jumping to conclusions didn't feel right. After a long pause, I typed out a quick reply, "Yeah, just a rough day at work. Thanks for checking in." I put my phone down, running my hand through my hair as I tried to steady my breathing. The photo still sat on the table, taunting me. My mind raced, thinking through all the possibilities. Who had taken it? Why leave it here? How did they get in? Trying to distract myself, I turned on the TV, hoping that some background noise would help calm my nerves. But I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept circling back to the unlocked door and the photo. It was almost like someone wanted me to know I was being watched. Someone who knew I'd come home tonight and find their little message. I stood up and walked around the apartment, checking the windows again, though I knew they were already locked. My eyes wandered over every corner of the room, looking for anything else out of place. Nothing. Just that photo. The buzz of my phone startled me again. Another message from Tom. If you need anything, let me know. I'm up for a while. I stared at the message, feeling uneasy. Tom had always been friendly, but now it seemed like he was paying extra attention. I hadn't noticed it before, but maybe I had never looked for it. Was I overthinking things? Or was it just a coincidence that he was always nearby, always checking in at the right time? I didn't respond to his message. Instead, I paced the room, glancing at the clock. It was past midnight now, and sleep felt impossible. My mind kept going over the day, trying to remember if I had seen anyone suspicious, anyone who might have followed me. Suddenly, a soft knock came at the door. The knock at the door sent a jolt through my body. I wasn't expecting anyone at this hour. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest as I tiptoed toward the peephole. It was Tom, standing there with his hands in his pockets, looking casual. For a brief second, I felt relieved. Then, I remembered the photo on the coffee table and the unlocked door. My nerves tightened again. I opened the door just a crack, trying to keep my voice steady. Hey, what's up? Tom smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Sorry to bother you. I thought I heard something strange, like someone messing with your door earlier. Just wanted to check in, make sure you're okay. I blinked, trying to process what he was saying. You heard someone? Yeah, probably just some drunk or something, but it didn't seem right, Tom continued, his eyes flicking past me into the apartment. Thought I'd make sure everything was cool. My hand gripped the edge of the door tighter. I wasn't sure what to make of this. Tom had always been friendly, but the timing of his concern felt off. And if he had really heard something, why hadn't he called me or knocked earlier? I'm fine, I said quickly, trying to close the door a bit more. Thanks for checking in. Tom's smile faltered just a bit. Okay, well, just let me know if you need anything. I nodded, forcing a smile before closing the door fully and locking it. As soon as I was alone again, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. I glanced back at the photo on the table, the reminder of someone having been inside, watching me. My phone buzzed again, and I nearly jumped. Another message from Tom. Sorry if I freaked you out. Just being a good neighbor. I stared at the message, feeling my skin crawl. He was being too attentive, too involved. It was hard not to connect the dots. First the unlocked door, then the photo, and now Tom always seeming to be around at the perfect moment. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. I decided I needed to talk to someone, so I called my friend Sarah. As the phone rang, I paced around the living room, my mind still racing. When she finally answered, her voice was groggy. Hey, everything okay? She asked, clearly half asleep. I don't know, I admitted. Something weird's been happening. Someone was in my apartment earlier, I think. They left a photo of me from today. There was a pause on the other end before Sarah spoke again. That's creepy. Did you call the police? I'm not sure what to tell them. And I stopped mid-sentence, glancing at the coffee table again, where the photo still sat. It felt like it was staring back at me, an eerie reminder that someone had been close enough to take it. I don't even know what to say. What if they think I'm just overreacting? Sarah's voice grew more alert. You're not overreacting. Someone took a photo of you and left it in your apartment. That's serious. You need to call them. I bit my lip, considering it. Maybe you're right. But it's just so bizarre. And Tom keeps checking on me. It's like he knows something, but I don't know if I'm being paranoid. Wait, Tom? Sarah asked, confused. Your neighbor? Yeah, I said, lowering my voice even though I was alone. He's been around every time something weird happens. He texted me just after I found the photo, said he saw someone hanging around my door. It's almost like he's watching me. Okay, that's weird. Do you think he could be involved? I don't know, I admitted, glancing nervously at the front door. He's always been friendly, but now it feels off. I don't know what to think. Sarah sighed. Look, I really think you should call the police. Even if it's nothing, better safe than sorry. And maybe keep your distance from Tom for a bit. Just in case. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Yeah, maybe I'll do that. Thanks, Sarah. Stay safe, okay, she said, her voice a little softer now. Call me if you need anything. After hanging up with Sarah, I sat in the silence for a long moment, but she was right. It was better to be safe than sorry. I dialed the non-emergency number, feeling a wave of anxiety wash over me as I waited for them to pick up. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded smaller than I intended. I'd like to report something suspicious, I said, trying to keep my tone steady. I think someone's been watching me, and maybe even inside my apartment. The dispatcher took down my information, asking for the details of what had happened with the photos and the sounds outside my door. I tried my best to explain, though it felt surreal even as the words left my mouth. By the time the call ended, they assured me that an officer would be dispatched to check things out. It wasn't long before I heard the knock at the door. My heart jumped, but when I checked the peephole, I saw the distinct navy blue uniforms of 2 police officers standing just outside. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and let them inside. One of the officers, a tall man with tired eyes, introduced himself. Ma'am, we're here to follow up on your report. Mind if we ask a few questions? I nodded, still feeling uneasy despite their presence. I led them into the living room, where they asked me to go over the events again in more detail. As I described the photos, the unlocked door, and the eerie feeling that I was being followed, the officer took notes, his partner occasionally glancing around the apartment. Have you noticed anyone suspicious hanging around recently? The officer asked. I hesitated. There's my neighbor, Tom. He's been really helpful, but I don't know. It's just a feeling. He's always around, checking on me, and it seems a little too convenient. The officer nodded, his expression unreadable. We'll talk to him. Just to cover all the bases. After I finished explaining everything, they went down the hall to speak with Tom. I stayed inside, pacing nervously, listening to the muffled conversation through the door. It wasn't long before the officers returned. Your neighbor says he hasn't noticed anything unusual, but he's concerned for your safety, the officer said, his voice calm. He offered to keep an eye out for anything strange. I nodded, not sure if that made me feel better or worse. Look, we don't have enough for a full investigation right now, the officer continued, but we'll keep a patrol car parked outside tonight, just in case. You should try to get some rest. I thanked them, feeling a slight sense of relief at the idea of police nearby. Maybe now, with someone watching over the apartment, I could get some rest. I couldn't sleep. The events of the night replayed in my mind, the unsettling photos, the noises outside my door, and Tom's messages. The fear settled in deep, keeping me alert, despite the police being outside. I stayed up all night, jumping at every creak in the apartment, every distant sound from the street. The small knife I had tucked into my bag for protection felt like my only source of comfort as dawn finally broke. The next day passed in a haze of routine, but the weight of the previous night's fear lingered at the back of my mind. I went through my workday mechanically, my body tired but my thoughts racing. By the time I finished my shift, the sky had already darkened, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. As I made my way home, I decided to stop by the convenience store a few blocks from my apartment. I needed something to help me unwind, maybe a snack and a drink to go with the movie I'd planned to watch. The store was brightly lit, a small beacon of normalcy amidst the growing shadows of the evening. I walked inside, the sound of the automatic doors hissing as they slid open. Grabbing a soda and a bag of chips, I wandered toward the counter, trying to shake the nerves that still clung to me. The cold night air felt sharp against my skin as I left the convenience store, clutching the plastic bag of snacks. Ever since I found those photos in my apartment, my nerves had been on edge. I kept one hand near the knife in my jacket pocket as I walked quickly through the dimly lit parking lot. Something didn't feel right, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The parking lot felt unnervingly still, the flickering streetlights casting long, distorted shadows over the scattered cars. The silence pressed in around me, broken only by the faint hum of the lights overhead. I quickened my pace, the sound of my own footsteps loud and uneven. My breath hitched, and I glanced back, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one. My heart pounded harder, every instinct screaming at me to move faster. The shadows felt like they were closing in, stretching farther across the pavement as I hurried toward the far end of the lot. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, just the leftover fear from the night before. Then, everything went dark. A bag was yanked over my head with brutal force, and strong arms wrapped around my throat, squeezing tight. Panic surged through me as I thrashed wildly, trying to scream, but the sound was muffled by the bag, my voice trapped inside. My lungs burned, desperate for air, but each breath came in shallow, choking gasps. The grip around my throat tightened, and my vision started to blur. My legs kicked up violently, but I couldn't break free. Every muscle in my body screamed for oxygen, for a way out, but the world around me was fading, slipping into darkness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My hand fumbled toward my pocket, feeling the cold steel of the knife. With the last ounce of strength I had left, I yanked it free and swung blindly behind me. I felt the blade hit flesh, and a low grunt of pain followed. The grip on my throat loosened just enough for me to rip the bag from my head. I gasped for air, stumbling forward, vision swimming as I tried to regain my balance. My entire body trembled with fear and adrenaline, but I forced myself to turn around. He stood there, hunched over, clutching his side where I had slashed him. Blood poured between his fingers, staining the pavement beneath him, but his eyes were locked on me with a burning hatred. "Who are you?" I rasped, my voice shaking, barely able to speak. His twisted grin sent a shiver down my spine. "You don't remember me," he said, his voice low, full of contempt. "Of course you don't." I stared at him, struggling to place his face. There was something familiar about him, but it was like grasping at a half-forgotten memory. "You think you're so much better than me," he hissed, taking a shaky step forward despite the wound. "You never even looked at me back then. You laughed, like I didn't matter." The memory hit me like a cold wave. High school. He had been there, always lurking in the background, quiet, unassuming. Someone I had barely noticed. I swallowed hard, dread settling deep in my chest. "You," I whispered, feeling a rising sense of horror. "I barely remember you. You rejected me, like I was nothing." He took another step, his breath ragged. "But I swore you'd pay for it one day." My pulse raced as his words sank in. This wasn't just some random attack. He had planned this. He had been waiting for this moment, fueled by a hatred I hadn't even known existed. "I didn't want your love," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "I wanted you to feel what it's like to be nothing. To feel hunted. To feel powerless." I backed away, my heart pounding against my chest. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That was years ago." His face contorted with rage. "You thought you could laugh at me and walk away. But I've been waiting. I've been waiting all this time to make you suffer." His legs gave out, and he collapsed to the ground, blood pooling beneath him as his breath came in shallow gasps. I stood there, paralyzed, watching him struggle to breathe, trying to comprehend the nightmare that had unfolded in front of me. A boy I barely remembered from my past had plotted his revenge for years, and now he had come for me. Then, I heard it. The soft chime of a text message. My pulse quickened as I looked down at his limp body. His phone must have gone off. My hands shook as I crouched down, reaching toward his jacket pocket. For a moment, I hesitated, but then I forced my hand inside. I pulled out his phone, the screen still glowing with a new notification. The message read, "Did you get the job done?" I opened the conversation and what I saw made my blood freeze. There were photos of me, walking to work, leaving my apartment, moving through my daily life. He had been watching me for weeks, maybe longer. Each photo was sent to him with a chilling, calculated precision. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I scrolled up further. The stalker had been communicating with someone else, someone who had been helping him all along. My blood ran cold as I read through the exchange. "Make sure she finds the pictures. Tonight's the night. I'm going to finish this." Then came the reply from earlier that night, "I don't care what you do, as long as I get paid." With growing terror, I pulled out my own phone and compared the unknown number to my contacts. My hands shook violently as I scrolled through my list, praying I was wrong. But when I saw the match, my heart plummeted. It was Tom. A wave of nausea hit me as the realization set in. Tom, the friendly neighbor who had always been so concerned, so helpful, had been involved from the beginning. He had been feeding information to my stalker, planting the photos, manipulating me. All for money. I felt numb as I dialed the police, my voice shaking as I tried to explain everything. Tom had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and I had never even suspected him. It didn't take long. A knock at Tom's door echoed through the hallway, louder than I'd ever heard before. I stepped out into the corridor, standing in the shadows as the police spoke to him. I held my breath as I watched the scene unfold. Tom opened the door, calm as ever, his face the picture of confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice dripping with faux innocence. They moved swiftly, stepping inside. Within moments, Tom was in handcuffs, his calm facade cracking ever so slightly. His eyes locked onto mine, just for a second, as they led him past me down the hallway. "You were always so easy to fool," he said, his voice low, cold, and with a grim smirk on his face. How could I have been so blind? He had been right there, pretending to care, pulling the strings the entire time. As I sat in my apartment, alone and shaken, I realized how close I had come to losing everything. Not just my life, but my sense of trust. I thought I had known who the real danger was, but the truth had been right in front of me the whole time, hidden behind a neighbor's smile. A stranger paid my cabin a midnight visit. She said we're being watched. A few weeks ago, I rented a cabin near Pitkin County, Colorado for a weekend getaway with my wife and daughter. For their privacy, I'll refer to my wife as Elena, and my daughter, who's between 4 and 8 years old, as Sophia. It was dusk by the time we arrived at the cabin, far later than Elena and I had planned. The afternoon's anticipation gone, the promise of a relaxing vacation already sullied, and my back sore from changing the tire which had been eviscerated by the forest road. The mood was thoroughly ruined. Maybe that should have been an indication as to how the rest of the trip would go. The cabin itself was beautiful and rustic. Nestled among the towering pines, the two-story building blended into the surrounding woodlands with its dark-stained wooden siding and stone chimney. Large windows glistened with the last light of day, and the wraparound porch boasted a hanging patio swing, much to Sophia's delight. She ran straight for it and started swinging as Elena and I carried the bags inside. When I unlocked the door and turned on the lights, I found myself surprised by the decor. In stark contrast to the classy, almost minimalist exterior of the cabin, the interior was remarkably cluttered. It was like every square surface, countertops, bookshelves, tables, etc., was covered in little trinkets. Tchotchkes, as my mother would have called them. There were coasters, candles, vintage oil lamps and compasses, and a bunch of wooden animal carvings, each about a foot tall. The interior wasn't dirty by any means, just more crowded than expected. I found it charming in a weird way, though Elena was less fond. I remember her taking a long look at the place and saying interesting, which is her code for I don't like what I'm seeing but I also don't want to make a big deal about it. It was past Sophia's bedtime, so after coaxing her off of the porch swing, I helped her get set up for the night. There were 2 bedrooms on the second floor, a master suite with an attached bathroom, and a smaller bedroom that was pretty clearly set up as a kid's room for visitors to the cabin. The cabin was specifically advertised as family-friendly and good for parents with younger children, so it was no surprise when the smaller bedroom was full of colorful toys and plushies. There was a fireplace across from the bed, its mantel showcasing a full set of those wooden animal carvings, 1 moose, 1 bear, 1 trout, and so on. There was also 1 particularly large teddy bear sitting on the bed, partially buried under the covers like it was getting ready for bed. Sophia instantly fell in love, and I thought it was sweet that the cabin's owner had gone the extra mile to make the place welcoming. I didn't love the idea of her cuddling it to sleep though, since it likely hadn't been washed between visits, so I propped it up on a chair next to the bed before tucking Sophia in for the night. Tired from our travels, Elena and I went to sleep not too long afterwards. Saturday was our designated lake day. After making breakfast and waking up Sophia, who had to be convinced not to take her new best friend Mr. Bear out on the water with us, we grabbed the kayaks off of our roof rack and headed down to the shore. We were a short walk from the lake and I was absolutely blown away by the natural splendor. Our cabin was semi-isolated, remote enough to give my family peace and privacy, but close enough to civilization that we could easily access help in case of an emergency. We were a 5-minute drive into town and a 5-minute walk to the nearest neighboring cabin, which we passed on the way to the lake. It was a gorgeous building, far more intricate and seemingly much older than the one we were renting. There was an older woman sitting on the porch as we passed it by, and although I couldn't wave since both hands were full with the kayaks, I gave her a nod and a friendly smile. She stared at me in response, her expression completely blank. She was looking directly at me, but almost looked like she was in a trance or something. "What was that all about?" I quietly asked Elena once we were out of earshot. "Not sure," my wife answered. "She looks pretty settled in there. Maybe that's her home and she doesn't appreciate her neighbor running an Airbnb." That seemed a logical explanation. I stole a quick glance over my shoulder before the house completely disappeared behind us, and saw that the woman was now walking down the steps of her front porch, her gaze still fixed on us. Elena and I exchanged worried looks and picked up the pace a little, Sophia running along ahead of us, joyful and oblivious. Once we reached the shore, we hopped into the kayaks and pushed off into the water. We weren't exactly running away from the woman, it was more so that we wanted to avoid a confrontation if we could. As we started paddling out into the lake, the woman appeared at the tree line, but never came any closer. I gave her a wave, and again, she gave me no response but a glower. It occurred to me that she might have been trying to warn us about the lake, maybe about a current or algal bloom, but I'd researched the area extensively to make sure it was safe, and her demeanor wasn't quite urgent or benevolent enough for that to be the case. The rest of the day was thankfully devoid of any more strange encounters. After a calm day of swimming and hiking, we returned to the cabin in the evening for dinner and esmores. Sophia brought Mr. Bear outside to help with the esmores, to mine and Elena's amusement. We had no idea how we would convince her to leave the stuffed animal behind when we left on Monday night. After we put Sophia to sleep at 8 p.m., Elena and I watched a movie, had a drink, and then went to sleep at 10:30 or so. At midnight, according to my phone clock, I heard what sounded like a knock. I sat up in bed, checked the time, and listened for a minute. A few seconds passed, and then there came 3 knocks in quick succession. I gently shook Elena awake, waiting to hear the sound again, and after a moment, I did. There was someone at the front door of the cabin in the middle of the night. Concerned, I got out of bed and tried to look out the bedroom window. I could only see a sliver of the front porch, and though I couldn't see an actual person, I could see the shadow of one thanks to the porch lights. Needless to say, I wasn't thrilled to have a stranger pay our isolated cabin a midnight visit. I told Elena to stay upstairs and made my way to the first floor, stopping by the living room to pull back the curtains ever so slightly and peer through the window. Still, given the shape of the house and the placement of the windows, it was impossible to see anything but a shadow. The person must have been standing an inch away from the front door. I scanned the front yard and the distant tree line, but didn't see anyone else, so a decoy/ambush situation seemed unlikely, but I still grabbed my handgun just in case. Just my luck, the old front door of the house didn't have a peephole, so I got up close to the door and tried talking to the person on the other end. "Can I help you?" I said. Instead of answering, the person knocked again, this time more urgently. No way in hell was I opening that door now. "Look, friend, if you need help you better speak up, otherwise I'm gonna have to ask you to get off my damn porch before I call the police." The knocking stopped, and after a moment, there was a woman's voice on the other side of the door. Her tone was nervous and her voice was soft. She said a single sentence. "He's watching your daughter through the bear." Of all the things I expected to hear from our unwelcome visitor, that was not one of them. I readied my gun and cracked the door open. When I looked out into the night, I saw the elderly woman from earlier quickly shambling away from my door. Her back was turned towards me and she looked like she was trying to get away from my porch as quickly as she could. I called after her, asking her what she was talking about, but she didn't look back. She just kept going until the night swallowed her up completely. I was pretty disturbed at this point, so I shut and locked the door and made my way back upstairs. Elena was waiting for me at the top of the stairs, and I quietly explained to her what was going on. Horrified, she went into Sophia's room and gently took the teddy bear out of our sleeping daughter's arms. We went downstairs and laid the bear out on the kitchen counter. I grabbed a pair of kitchen shears and dissected the thing, making an incision in its fluffy body and pulling out its cotton innards. It wasn't that I believed the old woman, just that as a parent, anything related to my kid's safety, even something that sounds outlandish, is something I take seriously. Even though the woman was likely suffering from some kind of cognitive impairment, I still wanted to investigate. I pulled all of the stuffing out of Mr. Bear and found nothing, though Elena pointed out that the bear had 2 very large glass eyes which could potentially be concealing a small camera. I was unable to find a hammer, but I did find a wrench under the kitchen sink. I wrapped the eyes in a kitchen towel and smashed them to bits, but when I sorted through the fragments, I didn't see anything that looked like a recording device. I was relieved, but I was also equal parts creeped out and angry. Maybe, like Elena had mentioned earlier, she was annoyed with the constant visitors to her neighboring cabin and was trying to scare us off. She might also have had some mental health issues or hallucinations. In either case though, how did she know about the teddy bear? Maybe she had visited the house before, or maybe it was just a lucky guess. Before returning to bed, I took a turn around both floors of the cabin, looking and failing to find anything out of the ordinary. Elena was also pretty freaked out, and she got up several times in the night to visit Sophia's room down the hall and make sure all was well. Needless to say, neither of us got much sleep that night. Sunday morning was all doom and gloom, which ended up being a perfect reflection of my daughter's attitude when she woke up and realized Mr. Bear was gone. Obviously, we didn't tell her what had happened, but Elena and I did our best to distract her with flapjacks and promises of a fun day of adventuring. Unfortunately, the hike we had planned was foiled by a downpour that, of course, the forecasts hadn't predicted, and so we decided to salvage the day by exploring the small town nearby. It wouldn't be the escape into nature we hoped for, but there were several family-owned restaurants and shops in the area, as well as a small library. The morning was all right. I enjoyed exploring the little town with my family, although there wasn't much to do. We had an early lunch at around 11 or so, but when we sat down, my wife started rifling through her backpack with a look of dismay. When I asked her what was wrong, she said that she didn't see Sophia's EpiPen, which we always like to have at the ready when we eat out. I realized immediately that I'd forgotten to put it back in Elena's backpack yesterday while I was reorganizing our stuff. I felt like such an idiot, and Elena, already grouchy from a sleepless night, really chewed me out for it. To make amends, I told her to wait with Sophia at the restaurant while I hurried back to the cabin for the EpiPen. She was displeased, but it felt like a better option than all of us braving the rain to return to the cabin. The drive back was an absolute nightmare. Sure, it was a short commute, but the dirt roads leading up to the cabin had turned to sludge in the heavy rain. I was in a foul mood when I entered the cabin. I shut the front door with a slam and made my way to the stairs. The house was dark thanks to the storm outside, dark enough that I almost missed the muddy shoe prints leading up the hardwood steps. When I saw them and realized what they were, I stopped in my tracks. I didn't have to wonder what they meant. Someone had been in the cabin since my family left, and judging by the fact that there was only one set of prints, they likely were still in the house with me at that very moment. I stood on the half landing, looking up at the second half of the staircase. The upper floor was eerily dark, so much so that someone could have been standing right at the edge of the staircase and I wouldn't have been able to see them. I carefully walked backwards down the stairs, keeping my eyes peeled in case any shape suddenly emerged from the darkness, and once I made it down the stairs, I turned around and ran outside. I sat in my car and called the police to report a break-in. After calling Elena to explain the situation, I sat in my car and watched the house until the police arrived, which took almost an unreasonable amount of time. I never saw any movement from inside the house, nor did I see anyone leave, though I didn't have a great visual on the back door. It's possible that the intruder could have slipped through the back and run straight for the woods, in which case the cabin would have obscured them. The police were shockingly curt and dismissive about the whole thing. One of the officers who arrived on scene asked me for proof of a break-in, as if I would have had time to snap a picture of the intruder in my house or something. They did a sweep of the cabin and found no one inside, but even so, I didn't want my wife and daughter to set foot in that building again. I texted Elena, telling her I was going to pack up our stuff and that we should leave a night early, and she agreed. The cops stayed with me as I packed to give me some peace of mind, which I appreciated. Aside from the shoe prints, there weren't any obvious signs of a break-in, and strangely, nothing of value had been stolen, even though I'd left my laptop laying out in plain sight. Thankfully, we'd packed light, so it didn't take me long to grab all of our stuff from the master bedroom and the bathrooms. My last stop was Sophia's room, where I was quickly able to locate and pack all of her things. Nothing of Sophia's had been stolen or tampered with, but there was something missing from the fireplace mantel. Right in the center, there was a circular impression in a fine layer of dust, indicating that a certain figurine had recently been separated from its wooden brethren. Someone had taken the bear. I must have been on autopilot because the next thing I knew I was flopping onto my couch. Exhausted but hungry, I sat there not wanting to move. Allison came up the stairs with a pair of grilled cheese sandwiches. I must have dozed off because I hadn't heard her cooking. She had also changed into shorts and a tank top without me noticing. "Are you all right?" Allison asked. "You had kind of a rough day. You want to talk about it?" I accepted the food thankfully. "Not really. I just feel like things are getting so much worse lately. Just today we've had 4 deaths and 6 missing persons. That's a lot." Allison was quiet. Wanting to change the subject, I tried asking about her personal life, but she didn't want to talk about it. I had assumed since her parents hadn't bothered to cut their vacation short after hearing she had been kidnapped, they must be pretty shitty people. But I really didn't know anything about Allison. She was 6 years younger than me. A little taller, extremely pretty, but no boyfriend. In fact, she didn't seem to have any friends at all. She just went to work and came home and slept. A knock at the door made me jump. I sat up a little straighter. Before I could stand though, I heard the door unlock and open. A voice from downstairs called out, "Honey, I'm home." I sighed in relief. It was just Dean. "Upstairs," I yelled back. Allison looked at me in confusion. "I didn't know you had a boyfriend." Her tone was oddly accusatory. "I don't. We aren't dating, we're just friends." She didn't look convinced. "And the friend has a key?" I nodded. "Yeah, what's wrong with that? He's a good guy. We're not dating, but I enjoy spending time with him." I heard the clunk of Dean dumping his service belt onto the downstairs table. The steps creaked as he jogged up them. He stopped at the top. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had someone over." "I can split." I told him that wouldn't be necessary and introduced him to Allison, who was acting strangely cold. She excused herself to the guest room, stating she was tired. When she was gone, Dean turned more serious. "So I want to talk to you about something. I was on that mental breakdown call this afternoon." I winced at the memory. "Yeah, I know. Pretty rough. But listen, Kay, that's the 7th call like that this week. And that's just the beginning." I heard the voice. "I'm not crazy." I heard a faint whisper coming from that blood-filled drain. It knew things that it couldn't have known. That no one knows. The reason in here, though, is because it said they will be coming soon, coming for the girl on the phone.